All right. How's it going, Chris?
I am doing fine. Like I said, it's been a very interesting couple of days.
Yeah. So I'm not going to make this terribly formal because I just don't care anymore. So you know that my reaction has partly it's a product of panic, but also trying to cover my ass.
Hmm.
But also too, I'm making a statement. So I
Yeah.
changed the name from How to D&D to How to RPG. And hopefully nobody comes to my channel looking to figure out how to assemble or use or operate a rocket-propelled grenade. But so far, nobody has. That's good. It is supposed to represent role-playing games, so I don't deal with rocket-propelled grenades.
Right, right. That being said, I actually make a lot of games where you can fire rocket grenades, but I think we've established at this point that if you enter RPG in Google, I'm pretty sure a rocket propelled grenade is the second click.
Yeah,
So,
probably. Yeah. So uh, we're doing this because I asked you, and this is pretty impromptu. And
mhm,
so you know, and I know what's going on with the open game license
right.
and the changes to that. We know what the focus is for Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro,
Mhm,
possibly, who's probably
right.
driving this, but we don't know for sure. But ultimately, moving forward, I know you've already talked about what you plan to do because a lot of you every time something like this happens, because when 4E came out, you just shifted your content from 3.5 and just made it available as a 4E product. It just changed things round and you operated under the GSL, right, rather than the open game license.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for me, it also helped that my company, their first product was 1 month before the GSL came out.
Yeah,
And my group were very persistent. Like, well, at this point, the idea of D&D misstepping, like we now have the precedent. We people look at what's happening now, they go, well, they've done this before. I go, yeah, back in 2008 they hadn't. So they were running off of the high of 3.5 for a decade almost. um, so they come out with fourth edition. Everyone assumes this is going to be the next evolution. And if this is going to be awesome because 3.5 was awesome. So when I signed on to the GSL, the writing still wasn't on the wall. A lot of people didn't start getting sour to fourth edition until the fall of that year. So when we signed on to the GSL, we believed that fourth edition would be as ubiquitous as 3.5 was,
yeah.
not realizing that that would not be the case. And by the time our product came out, it was somewhat incidental.
Yeah, and so I know some people who've been around a really long time are aware that TSR was quite aggressive in how they pursued people up to their destruction, self sabotage and destruction. But
Mhm.
that's not really the what we hear. I wanted to talk to you about moving forward
Yeah.
because for a lot of creators now they're thinking, well, even if I don't have to pay money to Wizards of the Coast, if I want to use Dungeons and Dragons, that IP,
Yeah.
even if I don't have to pay them because I don't fall within the threshold, there's nothing that should change them adjusting that, which there's no guarantee they will, because
Yeah.
I mean, is it financially viable to chase somebody who makes a fraction of the kind of money that they do? But then the other thing is that's not the real issue too. I mean, losing ownership of your own creations is a big issue. I know
Yeah.
you've always had an issue with that. You've told me I have an issue with that. I think other people do. But actually, that's not the biggest issue for me. It's what it's done. It's I guess the spirit of the original open game license is what people have built. Whole like completely different RPGs are built on the open game license, even when the structure of them is actually very different. Like I was looking at, and I didn't realize that Fate and Fudge are built under the open game license. I was like, you got to be kidding! They've actually included that as well, and like they're very different games.
Hmm.
The problem for me is even at the lowest tier, the lowest aspect of it, I cannot give them data on what I do. I don't have time for that. And me registering my stuff with them to then lose ownership of it in any way, shape, or form, I'm not really prepared to do that either. So, and yet I want to make D&D grow. So My only thought is, without breaching the terms of the new OGL, how do you, within the parameters of game mechanics, have a system in place that is similar enough to what we're used to, and how much do you have to strip away before it's still pretty much the same game, but you don't get into trouble and wind up in court? Because I was always intending to do this in 2024. I have been planning to do this for 2 years ago, before the pandemic. I was like, I've had enough. D&D 5e is actually not for me, and I feel like it needs to go down a different route. And I always believed there needed to be 3 engines. A very super simple engine that really had nothing tied to it, the standard game which we had, and then the advanced game, which is basically just tack on any kind of variant rule you can think of. So how much of Dungeons & Dragons 5 or Dungeons & Dragons, the game mechanics, is not actually IP stuff?
Well, here's the thing. The problem, I wouldn't say a problem, but the situation is that, with few exceptions, back in the 80s, this was a different situation. Every role-playing game was very different. And because at that point in time, a lot of people weren't really aware of IP law at that point in time. Remember I can't remember when the landmark case with Parker Brothers and Monopoly sided against them, and that's when they said that you can't copyright a rule, just the expression of that rule. And I think most people by the 80s weren't aware of those rules, and even when we got to the 3.5, I think a lot of people weren't really 100% aware of what they were. So, and what I said earlier today was that technically, when it comes to their copyright, they have said that they own trademarks on specific things, Dungeons and Dragons, and specific creatures, the Mind Flayer, the Beholder, and a few others. There are certain things that they are unable to because they're practically in the public domain. The term elf, dwarf, orc, stuff like that. These are things they cannot copyright because most of them were invented by other people before they were created. The other issue, this was the 4th edition thing, where 4th edition GSL said, we define these. If you sign on to the GSL, we've defined what these are. So we've defined what a gold dragon is. You cannot change a gold dragon. We've changed what a gray elf or an elf is. And so when I wrote Amethyst for 4th edition, I changed all their names to Fae, and elf is rarely ever brought up except in fluff. But in this new system, they don't have that clause of saying that we're defining everything. If you sign on to it, we're defining that. At least I haven't seen that. I wouldn't be surprised if that language is there as it's in the 4th edition system. But technically, when you get down to it, they own the name Dungeons and Dragons. They own those specific names and the illustrations associated with the names. And you could also say that they've copyrighted all their fluff. So anything that's fluff rated, all of their settings, anytime they said you're not allowed to use this, that's because that they're exercising their copyright. The reason why they have not gone after a single third-party product using the D20 ever is that they know that their legal rights to try to protect these rules is extremely vague. And the fact that 25 years after this thing was initiated, that they're now trying to exercise that, the reason why so many people believe that it's going to be very difficult for them to enforce it is because they failed to try to enforce it for 25 years since the system began. They have their legal rights, in my opinion, to those specific terms, but us third-party people don't use them anyway. The issue here is that, do you know the fact that Magic the Gathering, copyrighted term, the rules itself, there are games that operate almost exactly like Magic. The idea of having cards on a table and then tapping that card to generate abilities and doing something. I tap this card to generate revenue. It's a classic mechanic of Magic. We see it in 1,000 collectible card games. However, the word tapping, as associated with altering a card, is actually trademarked by Magic the Gathering, which means all of the collectible card games, they can mimic that exact same term because they can't copyright a rule. They just can't call it tapping. And so my worry is, in their attempt to try to express ownership, that they're going to try, because apparently they have to also try to copyright the terms the greatest role-playing game, which is incredibly arrogant, but they may end up trying to copyright stuff like we're copyrighting the term advantage in reference to this ability. They can go and say we're copyrighting strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, charisma as it is expressed. We're and they may attempt to do so because if they can copyright the term tapping, that creates a potential precedent of them trying to copyright every single terminology within the fifth edition architecture. But that creates a situation where they could potentially go after a bunch of people that have grandfathered in. Like there are games that use D20 that use similar attributes. So it's very difficult for them to try to do it now because they haven't tried to enforce this policy for 20 years. They've always enforced their IP.
So, currently my understanding is, and I could be wrong, is the concept of having a 20-sided dice to resolve something is not something they can copyright. So you could have a game system. Am I right or wrong about this? You can have a game system that uses any kind of dice, really, and whether it's a 20-sided dice or a 10-sided dice or a 6-sided dice, if it's used to roll to resolve something in a role-play game, you could probably build an RPG around that. Yes, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, once again, for full disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, so
No.
we have to make sure we get that out there. But the idea of a role-playing game and us assuming characters, those characters having statistics, those statistics having a number, and then rolling specifically various dice in order to achieve success. There are 1,000 different variations. You have the D6 system, you have D20 based systems like we see with Palladium, and other systems that use the D20. And so the thing is the fact that they say we're trying to copyright this specific rule mechanic. I go, the problem is the fact that if you're copywriting that, then companies that are older than yours can do the same thing because they have the exact same ability. So any time where Wizards has a rule that is in any way slightly similar to another rule, it's going to be hard for them to copyright it because someone can say, hey, look, your rule is exactly like this rule from this game from 20 years before you even tried to copyright this. Even a term like advantage, you roll twice, take the highest result. That's something that's probably the biggest new mechanic in 5th edition. It was this idea of advantage. But there are several games that employ that same idea. Malifaux uses the same thing with a deck of cards. So it's very difficult for them to try to say that they own these rules. Once again, in an America system, they say you can't. Yeah. They may say you can't copy paste our entry precisely, but it's not really that difficult to say to have the end result.
Yeah.
Right. I could, for example, I could take Player's Handbook and rewrite the whole thing, not using any of their expressions and having it say exactly the same thing.
So really, the wording advantage, disadvantage, maybe they can copyright that. I don't know if that's IP as such, but the actual game mechanic, whether you call it something else or you just express it in a different way, where you roll 2 dice for something that's give you a benefit and you take the highest result on the 2 dice. It's reroll mechanics are pretty common in almost all role play games, even if they're not built on under the OGL. Correct?
Yeah, like I said, I think once again, the precedent of Magic the Gathering is a perfect example. The fact that Magic the Gathering wasn't even the first cut to card game, but it was the biggest. And they set the standard, which so many games use, the idea of having a flop of cards, using powers to use those cards to activate other cards. And we see that with board games. Board games do this all the time. Board games, nobody has ever tried to copyright a rule in a board game ever since the whole fiasco with Monopoly. And I don't know how often you play board games. Board games are a huge portion of my life. Every time somebody creates a rule system for a board game, that becomes open source for everybody to use. And no one has ever tried to go after a company legally until they try to copy paste the actual wording from your manual, which has happened. It happened just 2 years ago with a company that was copy pasting parts of a manual of a book in their manual, and they got in trouble. But for example, deck building. There was a game called Dominion, very popular game, and it took the Magic Gathering aspect of building a deck and made that the entire game. They created a rule set, and now deck building became its own genre. There are games that are almost identical to Dominion and games that have broken off it, but they've created the deck building genre, and now there are 1,000 games that use it. And so in D&D, the same thing. When you create a rule set right now, you can look at Dungeons and Dragons, the D20 system, as being a set of rules, the same as a deck building or a worker placement game. This is the D20 set of rules. And like I said, since nobody has ever tried to copyright, and the funny thing is, D&D Wizards make their own board games. So they know perfectly well that they can't copyright the rules from their games because that's how the board game industry works. So it would be very, very tricky for them to try to copyright the rules of their role playing game, knowing perfectly well that they cannot own all of those rules because everything else is part of a community. Their rules share rules with other games that are older than them and so forth. So yeah, for me, in my opinion, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to try to copyright specific wording. The other issue, of course, is with the OGL. The OGL says you have access to the SRD, and the SRD is this document that says you can copy paste these things and put them in your game. So people who have done that, they're the ones that might be in trouble because they are, once the OGL comes off, then they can easily say this is a copyrighted document. You can't use any of this. So companies like I was mentioning Everyday Heroes that took the SRD and created their own rule set, they might have an issue because they do have copy pasted text from the SRD. I generally don't. So I'm in a slightly better situation.
So my understanding with all of this is that I mean, if they're they're deauthorizing the old OGL, which probably means that the old SRD is probably going to disappear and go away of the dodo as well. Because if you don't get rid of that, then you kind of like, it's either going to be null and void and be replaced by something else, because like they don't want people to play 5e, they want people to play 1D&D or 6th edition when they finally release it in 2024.
Yeah, they want people's money through a microtransaction system. Like they're turning D&D into the next mobile game.
Yeah, so I paid for D&D Insider for 4e, and I can assure people that it was not successful. It was expensive. My players loved it because I paid for it as I was a dungeon master, but it did not get them to spend a goddamn cent. So, but that's not my point. So I'm thinking advantage and disadvantage. I mean, suddenly if you decide, okay, I don't want to use the word advantage, disadvantage because maybe that looks too similar. Maybe I don't want to use the exact wording, but I can have, roll 2 dice, take the lowest result, take the highest result, and then what you just call one of them highest result as benefit and penalty for the low result, and then, like you could print that probably.
Yeah, you could easily say a rule: roll 2 dice, take the highest result, because that is a mechanic that in no way. The question is whether or not we could call it advantage, disadvantage, and I seriously believe you probably can. In the same way as where, them copywriting the term tapping in reference to a card. That's that precedent where you're worried that whether or not they're saying no, we have the term advantage when describing 2 dice. In situations like that becomes very dangerous once again, because that means they can basically lock up the 6 stat lines of strength through dexterity, which so many games, even games that are not compatible with D&D, use in some capacity. So that becomes like, because I remember two things. I always remember the fact that will they go after the small players? And I remember when 20th Century Fox was producing their first Alien versus Predator game, they sent cease and desists to every single company, a group of fans that were just creating their own conversions for Doom or Duke Nukem. These were harmless, and yet they still sent cease and desists. But they only did so once they knew they were making their own game. And then something I brought up in my live stream also was Goodman Games. I mentioned Goodman Games signed on to the GSL, but because the GSL said you couldn't release a product until November of that year, I think it was November, he decided to circumvent that and release a handful of modules for Dungeon Crawl Classics. This is before Dungeon Crawl Classics became its own system, under 4th edition. Now, I wish I had one here. I don't, but it basically says 4th edition compatible. It's on my bookshelf behind me. It's 4th edition compatible. And if you open the page, and I opened 2 of them, and there was no OGL printed at all.
Yeah.
There was completely OGL absent. The 3rd one did, which I thought was confusing. And I only think that it did because it might have been copy pasting something from the old 3.5 system, but the other 2 didn't. Now, he did still express his monsters exactly the same way, right? So the monster stats were still the same. So he obviously believed that he could still present his monsters like the way the fourth edition does without causing issue. The only thing that was a bit of an oddity was one specific word, and that was the word bloodied. Now, the people who know fourth edition, one of fourth edition's big introductions for rules was something being bloodied. If you were reduced to half hit points, you became bloodied, and certain things that you did activated once you became bloodied. I love that mechanic. I wish they'd bring it back. But because Goodman was slightly worried that they might try to copyright the term bloodied in how it's describing in this system, in the first book, it wasn't called bloodied. All of his characters became bruised.
So he changed the word, but the concept was the same.
But it was like the same. But just that one, not armor class, not strength, not any of that, not reflex defense, nothing. But bloody got changed to bruised. Now, it should be noted that in the next book, the monsters said bloodied on their monster stat, which I thought was unusual. And then when the third book came out, the OGL 3.5 OGL was in there. So I always thought this was very unusual that they were producing. Now, at no point did WotC file a lawsuit or start litigation. The irony, of course, is the fact that if they did, they would be moving litigation against the largest company that signed on to their GSL. But they didn't. In fact, Goodman had told me in a conversation, and I don't know if it was a conversation with me or whether or not it was with somebody else, and I picked up on it. I think it might have been a private conversation where he said, I was talking with them. I do believe that he was at Gen Con talking to Wizards of the Coast, and he told them right there what he was planning on doing, and he believed that he had a legal right to be able to do that. So they knew before he released those games that that's what he was planning on doing. And they did not make a play. They did not make a move because I believe that they knew they didn't have a legal case. Now, this is in a situation back when, like I said, almost nobody who runs Wizard now was running Wizards back then, right? We know that. And we also know that if they were, we would never have seen the GSL at all, likely, or it would have been as restricting as this new 1.1 is out now. Like, we're dealing with a massive paradigm shift at the core level. They are trying to redefine, ironically enough, the base foundation of what Dungeons and Dragons is, which is something that no one has tried to do in the history of role playing.
So, I mean, I've kind of seen this going down this road. I didn't realize they would go quite to this extent, and also too, for me, I don't care whether they decide to backtrack as far as I'm concerned, but. My question is, and let's go back to, because you were saying those 6 abilities, the strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, charisma. Now, will people, if they were to try to build another RPG, and of course we're not lawyers and neither are you, and I know this is all disclaimer stuff, but if they decide to use that wording in their newly formed RPG, would that be an issue, or would they have to alter the wording in that respect?
That's a good question. Like, we know, for example, the idea of having a stat block has been around since the 80s. Yeah. What those stats are can change. Man, I should have came prepared and brought some of the other books with me, because I know if I grabbed into some of my books, GURPS, the Palladium system, which we see with Robotech and Rifts and so forth, which is a system they use for a lot of their systems, and these systems were written completely independent from D20. These games were made before 3.5 was even conceived. GURPS uses a 3 to 18 number range, right? So I do believe Palladium does as well. About the only system that doesn't, to my knowledge, is the variations on the fusion system, which is what Mechtin and Cyberpunk 2020 would have came out of. And their idea is the fact that you had a stat between 1 and 10, your skill was between 1 and 10. You add those two together with a die 10 to create your final result. I love that. It was simple, easy, and there wasn't any interpretation. I had a scale between 1 and 10. If I was 10, I was the best. And there was no interpretation, not like, oh, you have an 18 dex, so you have a +4 modifier or any of that BS. So there already is a lot of games that are using these stat blocks. So if someone says you can't use strength, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, like you can't copyright the term charisma, right? Other games use intelligence as a stat block. Other games use dexterity. They may not use all six in exactly that form, but one at least that was the thing. That's the whole issue because we've created this tapestry of rules, and it's almost like when you're dealing with the culinary landscape of Africa. Someone says, "Oh, yeah, in this area, this is where they use curry." I go, "No, no, they use curry through the whole area, but when you travel east, eventually these rules this pops up, and as you travel east in India, coconut shows up." And it's the same thing with these games. There's so much carryover between almost every system. There are very, very, very few game systems that are completely agnostic, where they have no detachment to any other system. There were definitely, especially in the 90s, but oddly enough, since 3.5 came out, even the entirely original systems were still employing that. And remember, we still have OSR, and OSR is basically a public domain rule set that is based off of the classic D&D.
Yeah.
So if they're trying to copyright that, they would have to try to copyright rules that were written by people who were no longer associated with them when it was part of a company that they never owned. Right? So it comes down to a situation that they're trying to copyright strength, dexterity, intelligence. They would have to try to find a way to copyright something that they in no way had a hand in creating.
So that essentially means that something like Old School Essentials is probably safe because it's operating off the public domain game that was originally made, right? That they, I mean, they bought TSR and they bought all the assets. But that really means that if somebody was to decide, okay, well we're going to play Old School Essentials or D&D Basic, the original Dungeons and Dragons, and then make content for that, they probably could. I mean, they probably wouldn't make very much money off it necessarily, but they probably could. They could probably even make a rule system based off that, and it wouldn't be an issue. Correct? That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, theoretically, like I said, this is one of the things where I've been tempted, where I could take, if I wanted to create a system, like for example, if you want to, this is my belief that if you made a system that was not compatible with 5e or D&D in general, so it wasn't compatible with 3.5 or 4th edition or 5th edition, but you made a system that used all their terminology, but was not compatible with their systems because the rules in themselves were different, I would think it would be virtually impossible for them to file a legal case against you by saying, well, this game's the same as ours. I go, well, it's not. It's not compatible with yours. So, for example, and this is something that I've been thinking about, if I looked at 3.5 rule set, 4th edition's rule set, and 5th edition's rule set, and created a hybrid that was not compatible to any of them, but was still a fully recognized variation of this rule set, would that be allowed? And I think I don't think that they would have a case to try to suppress it because it's not compatible with any of their systems. And obviously, I wouldn't be using their wording, right? But the idea of taking the best of 3.5, 4e, and 5 and creating this new hybrid, that's fascinating to me. That's interesting. The issue is adoption. Ultimately, it comes down to adoption. If D&D had 10% of the market share and Fate had 80% of the market share, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We would all be writing for Fate and no one would be worrying. If Numenera was the dominant system on the planet, the only reason why we use D&D is not because we like the system. We don't like the system. D&D is broken. I admit it.
I agree. I know it's broken. And that's part of the reason why a lot of people like it and a lot of and reason why people hate it.
It has classic archetypes, which are very popular. It's a classic fantasy. It's the bare bones vanilla fantasy on which a lot of systems are based. And it has an infrastructure and a rule system that a lot of people know because it's one of the oldest. It goes all the way back to the 80s, even though the rule systems are completely incompatible back then. But it has that legacy. It has that legacy that people associate with. That's the one advantage. But the rules themselves are actually kind of meaningless. What they're trying to suppress primarily is the association with their product line. Mm-hmm. They believe that by associating with 5e, that people are using their intellectual property without permission. And what I was saying in my video is that that's actually not the case. I just feel, my perspective, I don't care about D&D. I care about market share. And if Paizo Pathfinder was 80% of the market share, and that was the issue with fourth edition. Fourth edition, I had to write for 5 different systems because there was no dominant market share. We had 20, 30% market shares, right? Pathfinder was at about 35%. D&D was about 35, 32%. At one point, Pathfinder actually passed it, but there was no one big system. So when I wrote the first Amethyst, I wrote it for 5 different systems, and that was a nightmare. When D&D comes along, and now suddenly D&D has a 60 to 70% market share, and Pathfinder has been reduced to 5, it's hard when someone says, "Are you right for Pathfinder?" I'm like, I like the system, but there is no money in it. My favorite system, I loved writing 13th Age. Loved it. And the fan community is amazing. The people who made it are amazing. There's no money in it whatsoever. And for people who do this as a hobby, it doesn't matter. Money is not really important. No. But for people like me, where it is their primary income stream, it becomes critically important. So yeah, in many ways, I'm married to the 5th edition system because it's predominant. Yeah. But I'm not married to the IP that is connected to the 5e system. I don't use it. I don't need it. I've never needed to put the word D&D anywhere associated with my product. But they're claiming that through tangentially, because I'm using their rules, I am. And that's this complicated thing. I go, and then our point is, yeah, except the fact that you don't own those rules. So where is this connection? It's almost like 6 degrees of separation. We are all 2 degrees of separation from D&D. And that should be legally fine. And Wizard is saying it's not.
So I have actually 3 questions. So I have been under the impression that actually those people who find themselves in a pickle because they are creators might actually find that they're probably better to make system agnostic material, which sounds all very well when you say it. It's easy to say, it's harder to do, because making system agnostic material is actually quite difficult, correct? And then or trying to make a product that can be used on multiple platforms, so that you have a bigger market share. It sounds all well and good. It's probably the safest route, of course. And then, of course, the other thing you suggested, which is like you make the same product for different game systems and you spread yourself over, but of course you wind up working very long hours and probably go quite insane as you try to pick up as much of the money that you can, a little bit here and a little bit there. You're muted, by the way. You're muted.
Yeah, the Fate and Savage World editions were actually written by somebody else. Pathfinder was a nightmare because it's not a easy system to grok or figure out. Like writing monsters for Pathfinder was the longest chapter of any writing I've ever done. So yeah.
So those are things that people could do to weather this or adjust to the climate that's likely to change, is go agnostic or try to write for multiple systems rather than D&D. But of course, then they're going to have to write for a lot of different systems to be able to pick up enough money, which you've just pointed out. The other thing I was thinking is, I suppose that the term ability score or strength score might be something they can IP, plant an IP on, but not necessarily the concept of abilities and strength. Yes, no? What do you think?
Well, first of all, yeah, they would have to do a lot of filing, because Magic, it has one dominant rule, tapping. That's basically it. That's the only thing they really wanted to copyright because it was associated with their system. They wanted to have that term. D&D is a much different beast, a much more complicated beast. They would have to file copyrights on 100 different terms, not saving throws, strength ability scores, armor class. These are all things that hit points. They would all have to try to file copyrights on all of these to try to completely gain ownership of the system in all its iterations. And if they did that, you can't file that privately. People would find out about it. People knew that they had filed for tapping because there are people that know these things. So I believe that if they had made a conscious effort to try to copyright every single title term, every definition, without copyrighting the explanation, but copyrighting the term, I think we would find out about it. And I think if we looked at it and realized that they had filed copyrights on 20 different terms, and now they're saying that we can no longer say the words ability score, saving throw, armor class, or hit points. Well, good luck on hit points. Armor class may be a bit easier, but that, like I said, it's one of those situations where I wouldn't put it past them considering what's been happening recently. But that is a lot of work to try to crush competition.
So, considering they haven't got those IP rights, they don't have an IP that says hit points is ours, or armor class is ours, or saving throws is ours, or attack rolls is ours, correct?
Yeah.
Or ability checks are ours. What happens if they were to go through that rigmarole with your system? What do? You do, well, it's no longer hit points, you make it health points.
Yeah, theoretically, the moment you change the name of anything,
Yeah.
right? When you change strength to might, charisma for attractiveness, or something like that, you basically are doing the same thing. And at that point, there's nothing that they can do.
Yeah.
That's one thing I'm 100% positive. If you created a system that had rules that were identical to fifth edition, but every single definition's title was changed, there is nothing that they can do, because they cannot, because of the precedent that they cannot define a rule set. They can try to copyright the title of that rule set, but they can't define you rolling a die 20 to recover from an imposed effect. That's something that they cannot copyright. Can they copyright saving throw? Maybe. But I think by this point we would know if they had.
So I was looking at some of the older systems and I thought, well, actually, even if they can potentially copyright saving throw, what's to change somebody from just calling it a save?
Exactly. Once again, and the funny thing is, I do believe the fifth edition language does refer to it as a save. I don't believe I can't remember whether or not, like, there is some situations. I'm trying to remember now. Do they even call it a full saving throw in fifth edition, or is it just a save?
I think they call it a saving throw. I think they do. It's a saving throw. But then attack roll, even if they were able to pin that down, which I find unlikely, because I think too many RPGs that are not open.
It's also too generic.
It's way too generic. And even if they could pull it off, then what do you call it? You call it an attack. You don't even say roll.
Yeah, exactly. There are ways to. The only thing, like when it comes to circumventing their terminology, the only thing that worries me is the strength, intelligence, dexterity, charisma, because those are so iconic. I can say attack instead of attack roll, and you know what I'm talking about. I can say a save instead of a saving throw. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. It's whether or not they're going to say copyright the term armor class, but they can't. Can they copyright the term AC?
Or can you get away with just calling it armor and you don't even call it armor class?
Precisely. Like, these are terminologies you can work around. If you're making an adventure, this is easy because your game is about the monsters, and that's the only thing you need to worry about. If you're making a rule system source book like I do, where I'm adding so much onto the texture, the only thing I have going for me is that, once again, like I said, I don't copy SRD stuff. My last product, which was Affinity, never copied a single rule out of the SRD. Everything was added to it. Now, if you were to look at it and go, is there stuff that, you can say they can make a class that two-handed weapons are somehow copyright, or they can say that reach as a definition is something they own. Good luck, but it's one of those situations where they have a massive legal battle if they are trying to copyright 30 or 40 different terms. And like I said, fourth edition, with Goodman Games, he worked around it. But even still then, he still used the terms hit points, armor class, strength, intelligence. He didn't change those because he believed that they did not own those terms. And anytime anything goes to court, someone's like, don't forget this happened. This happened in fourth edition. And people wrote around it. And that's the precedent. And that's what I always remember. I always remember Goodman Games. And I think it's very, very happy that I had that relationship with him back then, because I know he did it. I know he got away with it because he believed that they could not move legally against him, and they didn't.
Yeah. So even the concept of an ability check, because it's a terminology that's in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, and I mean it's been around for a little while, right? It's been in other versions of the game. I mean, well, suddenly ability check becomes ability test.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah, like I said,
you take out the word check and roll, and it's a test.
yeah.
You know, you got a saving test. You have an attack test. You have an ability test. So suddenly the those concepts of I can hold on to this, and as long as the wording is not directly ported and cut and paste, and you've adjusted it in some way, a lot of those very generic sort of concepts sort of like disappear in terms of like, well, they just fall into the ether of the role play global community that's been going on for a while. So it actually means that somebody could, if they really wanted to, if they decided they really wanted to do this, and I know there's a lot of people, Chris, and you probably already know, and I know you're already trying to make one yourself. Everybody's talking about let's make our own role-playing game. Of course, the problem with making your own role-playing game is trying to get people to actually play the role-playing game. And but what would be interesting is somebody made a game that was so simple that just came down to your ability check to do something, your attack roll or attack test, your saving throw or saving test. You've got your basic ability scores, and all it's really trying to do is resolve something that player characters are trying to do, and the dungeon master's using the narrative, right? I mean, at the core of any role-playing game, that is the only thing that you really need, correct?
Yeah, well, see, talking about the idea of the system, the reason why people have asked me why I haven't written my own system, and I say I'm more interested in the fluff and the lore and playing with something that's established. Because when you write a role-playing game from the ground up, then you're stuck with having to test it and make sure it's perfectly balanced. D&D is admittedly not perfectly balanced, but it's a system that people accept, so we are able to use that. And that's the only reason. I just don't want to put the effort into writing my own system. That's the first thing.
Yep.
The second thing is that I don't have an established IP. You'll notice that with a few exceptions, the Lord of the Rings being a very interesting development because Lord of the Rings is under 5e. So that's going to be really interesting going on. But
there's a few, isn't there? There's not just them. I saw there's a lot of IPs that are being...
Yeah, but that's the one that really jumped out. But recently, there's been role-playing games for Blade Runner, Homeworld, Alien. And because these are established IPs, it's really easy to create your own bespoke system. In fact, knowing what's happening now, if you have a bespoke system, regardless whether or not you want to own it or not, it doesn't matter because you're no longer connected to somebody else's IP. And that's one of the biggest reasons why, if I was said, we want you to make a game based around Tron, I would say, sure, I would create an original system because even before this happened, I would want to go with an original system. I've talked with, I have some friends who are associated with another business company, and I'm working on a package to pitch them a game based off Ghost in the Shell. Right. And although I think it would be inspired by D20 system, it would still have to be 100% whole cloth. If I ever got to a situation where I was contracted to do that, like we want you to write the rule system from here, but you can't use D&D. At that point, I would create my own system whole cloth and use that as the baseline for all other game systems I would make that wouldn't be associated. And that's the thing where I think about does someone bother taking D&D and rewriting the whole system with the words changed and then putting that as an OGL just so people can create it? Or does a large group of people, a la Pathfinder or Paizo, get together and go, let's create something that's compatible with that's close to our systems? The problem with that, so many of them are married to 5e or their own systems, which them ourselves are based off of 3.5. So the problem, they go, well, don't worry, I'll just have Paizo's Pathfinder. I go, Paizo's Pathfinder is under threat as much as anybody else. They're more under threat than me because they do use stuff from the SRD and I don't. So for me, the appeal would be like, if I was to create a system whole cloth, I would do, as I said, the best of these various editions from third edition all the way to fifth edition. Yeah. I would create a system like that, but it wouldn't be 100%. It wouldn't be compatible in any way. And then, as you said, I can change all the wordings because it's my system, it's my game. I don't have to be beholden to that system. But if you're doing that, that's a lot of effort for something that you might not need to do.
Yeah. So here's the other thought that I had, Chris, and I mean, at Dungeons and Dragons' absolute core are the things we just discussed.
Yeah,
At its core.
yeah,
At its core. But how things like races or now species work, something like races or species or creature type or playable creature type or whatever the heck they want to call it, depending on the current mood of the population and political movements and social movements and whatever else. If you suddenly decide to make a core system like that, but you just leave that open for third party and home brewers to make their own thing, like you just eliminated a hell of a lot of extra work for yourself, and you just made yourself an opening to make a whole lot of stuff for the rule system in the future. And your document for your first rule system, it winds up being quite a lot smaller. And I have been thinking about this a lot, like for about more than 2 years. I was like, what if suddenly something like races and species and creature type, that we just left that to third party or home brewers to decide. That's what we'll let them build that. And even with the classes or adventurer types, I mean, whatever you want to call the damn thing, I don't even think that the word class as a character class is something they could plonk an IP stamp on.
it has to be a terminology. Armor class could be,
Yeah,
but just saying that's the issue. The fact that they couldn't copyright the word intelligence.
yeah,
Obviously, they would have to find some way of copyrighting the stat block in its entirety.
yeah,
That's because that's the direction. Like they can't go at because you can't copyright the word charisma. That's just you would have to copyright the stat block in its entirety as presented.
yeah.
And
But
go
but
ahead.
I mean, would you agree though that if you were to suddenly have a system and that because I am, if you hadn't figured it out, there are a lot of people out there trying to make an RPG who are not going to be following D&D, and for a variety of different reasons. Now, whether they go to OSR content, whether they decide to sign up to the new license that's going to be offered officially at some point when Wizards of the Coast finally gets back in the office and decides how to deal with all of this. If they suddenly have, a system where there's a whole lot of empty spaces for third party to deliberately make content for, and it's so similar to what already exists in D&D at its very core. So one of the reasons I've always said, at its very core, D&D, if you strip it right back, you actually leave more space to do stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Well, you get down to yeah. No, you hit the nail on the head. Now, have you ever played Fusion, the Artel Zorian OGL?
No, I haven't played Fusion. I've played Fate and Bulldogs, and
Yeah.
I mean, you probably know a bit about Fudge and Fate, and Bulldogs is just another version of Fate. A little bit.
Yeah.
It's such a simple system.
Yeah.
You have a selection of skills, and you have a lot of narrative descriptors, and there's usually only two or three, and it all fits on one page very simply. And you're rolling a six-sided dice, and your numbers are very small, so there's not this huge variation. It's a very simple system to play and understand, but to master it is a different story.
Yeah. That's your phone, not mine. Okay. So for me, Artel Zorian began with something they called Interlock, which was this D10 based system that Cyberpunk 2013 and Mechton had. When they got to Mechton 2 and Mechton Zeta, they kind of perfected that system. But at that point, Cyberpunk went off in a slightly different direction. So even though they had the basic mechanics are the same, there were some specific things. How Cyberpunk handled hit points was completely different than what Mechton did. So they went off in their direction. At some point after that, they worked with a game company called Hero Games to create a universal system, and they called it Fusion. And Fusion took the best hits of the Mechton and Cyberpunk systems and combined them into a single universal, completely setting agnostic set of rules. These rules were 24 pages. And when they started doing adventures, I think the first one they did was Bubblegum Crisis. Bubblegum Crisis starts with those 24 pages, and then the rest is basically just setting at that point. They did it with, I think, Vodums and a few others. And interestingly enough, when they stopped producing that, a company called Gold Rush Games created the action system. The action system is action with the exclamation mark.
Yep.
Gold Rush doesn't exist anymore. We were going to work together on a few projects, but the action system is a carbon copy of Fusion, like carbon copy right down to the basic. There's only a couple rules that are different between action and Fusion. They are identical systems. And to my knowledge, there was never any legal action put up. But like I said, this was before 3.5, before the idea of an entirely free open gaming system came about. So like I said, the precedents are there, and these mechanics are, like I said, it'd be very difficult for them to try to copyright all of it without infringing on somebody else's. Because if someone sets a precedent that you can copyright a definition, then every other company that's around going, well, we copyrighted these as well, and ours predate yours, so we're going to take you to court because you're trying to copyright something that we own. And then at that point, WotC just gets flooded with a bunch of litigation. And that's the thing, is that right now, it's like, are they prepared? Someone did the calculations and said the most amount of money that Wizards is hoping to make from this was $770,000, because that's how much revenue that they would earn from this new contract. And considering that their profit margin for D&D alone was $300 million, $700,000 doesn't seem like much.
Yeah, but that's only calculated off Kickstarter. That's that I remember seeing that entry, but that doesn't take into consideration the likes of Critical Role and MCDM, which are pretty big bodies, and there's a few others.
I'm looking forward to seeing what happens there.
A lot of people are thinking that Matthew Mercer or Critical Role are going to roll over, but Matthew Mercer has got his pulse on the community, and no matter what you say about Matthew Mercer, he's got his heart in the right place, and
more importantly,
the sort of person he would probably put his foot down and lose it.
It's more than that. It's Vox Machina is a valuable IP. There's a cartoon and so forth. He actually has an IP that's worth millions and millions of dollars. And if he doesn't say anything, and if he throws out support to this new OGL, if he were to, that would tell us that he has what's that word? A type of clause that's just for him, a favorable clause, like he has this specific contract that he himself only has, and that's a problem. We're worried about the fact that all the big companies that Wizards doesn't want to get into litigation with, they're all being offered these tasty deals so they can stay supporting the system and not sue them. And that's kind of the word, because Paizo hasn't said anything. Green Ronin and Mongoose have been kind of quiet.
Yeah.
So the biggest companies on the market, the companies that would have been pulled into this conference call that supposedly happened a couple of weeks ago, they have been quiet. And that is really concerning me. And there's probably a very good reason why they're quiet. And all the other small companies are speaking up. I think like N-World is probably the biggest entity that has been vocal about this system. But the fact that we don't hear anything, in fact, I have a couple of people that run Green Ronin and Mongoose on my friend list. They are not saying anything. And that people have asked them, what's going on? What's your stance? And the fact that we haven't heard anything from Mercer, we haven't heard anything public from Paizo or Green Ronin is concerning.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not surprised, because that's the sort of thing you would expect, because there'll be, NDAs involved. I mean, I've had to sign NDAs. You've probably had to sign NDAs for stuff as well. And you can't say anything until that thing is it's run its course, and that's just how it is. But I'm also under the thinking in terms of, like, whoever's out there who is thinking, well, I'm going to try to make a system that is similar enough to Dungeons and Dragons, whatever version it is, but I leave all the pieces that might get me into trouble undeveloped for third party to build themselves, and whatever way they see fit. You actually open up the market quite a bit. I Like backgrounds don't have to be called backgrounds. Backgrounds can be called origins. They could be called
Life path.
life path. Yeah, there you go. Life path. They can be called. Oh, geez, they could be called ancestries. I mean, they can be called a lot of different things.
But even you nailed it actually just a little while ago. Sorry, but you were just commenting on the fact that they themselves changed their names. They dropped race in favor of species.
Yeah.
So even they are changing their definitions.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there, as soon as you start doing that, then well, you kind of muddied the waters a little bit as it is. So now it's sort of opened for, well, actually no, because you didn't want to use race before. Now you're going to species. Are you going to try to keep race and species within your game system? But I think if anybody's out there and they're thinking they're going to build a game system, leave lots of holes. Like just do. I mean, if it would be me, this is how I'd be thinking about it, Chris. I'd be thinking, whatever you make, it should be something that's super simple, that has just the framework there, and that you can just build on, whether they want to homebrew it or buy third-party content. And then what you do is you take that, you chuck an open game license on it if you really think you need to, and then you just take it and you just put that out there. You just put it out there and just make it freely available. I wonder how much that would annoy Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast. But you don't just put it out there. You put it out there to as many different content creators as you can possibly find, and say, look, just offer that as a free PDF when you're selling your other products, and leave it at that. Because I mean, how would you be able to contend with that? Particularly because they can obviously, if they find something that they don't like, they can try to buy somebody up and then shut down that rule system, right?
Yeah.
That would be the next thing, is if somebody tries to make a rule system and it actually does start to hurt them, or takes part of, doesn't give them the kind of control they want over the market, then they will buy you out. And if you're small enough, you can be bought out. You just got to offer them enough money, right?
Yeah, and I think, but here's the thing. This is somewhat academic, what we're talking about. We're speculating.
Yes.
But there's one thing we're kind of forgetting, and that is, even if the attempt to do, like, we're talking about these clauses in this contract, and we're forgetting one critical thing, which is what, like, people are locking on two really big problems. First is signing on to the OGL gives them royalty-free access to your content, which from an ownership factor, no one's going to do.
Yeah.
No one in the right mind is going to do that. Then you have the other clause, which is disconnected from the ownership of 1.1, saying that the previous OGL is no longer valid. That itself, that if you were to eliminate everything else, that one clause is the single biggest issue.
Yes.
Regardless of whether or not they're trying to copyright the terminology or trying to go after people for using their definitions. The fact that they are trying to remove an OGL, because that puts thousands and thousands of books technically in violation of what they claim to be copyright. Yeah. They could go, it's the precedent of trying, the fact that the people who wrote the OGL said it was irrevocable. And now we're looking in hindsight, where I go to people like Monty Cook, Ray, what's his name, who have both said publicly that the OGL was never meant to be revoked. And I go, great, why didn't you say that?
Yeah.
If they had just said irrevocable in the contract, in the OGL, none of this would have happened. But because it says perpetual, and there's dialogue in there that implies that this OGL is a mutually beneficial relationship, now we're dealing with a situation. If it said irrevocable, nobody would be complaining. Like, whatever, they can do what they want. We'll just say it on to the 5.5. It says we will revoke it. You can't. It says irrevocable. And that's the point. There's nothing they can do. They can't legally go after anybody. But because they're trying to revoke that previous license, that's what puts everybody in this bind. If they came out and said, here's the contract, and nothing's changed, but that clause was gone, 99% of the people wouldn't have a problem with that at that point, because they won't adhere to the 1.1. They'll just stick with 1.0. They can say,
which is why they put that there. That's why they put it there.
But they could get so much better with the carrot than the stick.
Yeah.
Right. One of the reasons why I went on the GSL was the fact that they would mention your product and you got this wonderful little plaque that says compatible with fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons. And you actually got to have Dungeons and Dragons on your book. That was worth that. That was worth the price of admission. If they came out and said, if you sign on to the 1.1 OGL, you can go on our virtual tabletop. You can sell your product off of our virtual game front. You get access to cool things that say you're compatible with actual name Dungeons and Dragons. Look at all this. And all you need to do is sign your IP away. Some people would take it because they're like, you know what? I'll make a new IP that's just for them and they can have it, but I'll keep my own thing. There's something I would think, oh yeah, I'll do ultra modern. Ultra modern is setting agnostic. Here you go. I'll love to be on VTT. On D&D's official VTT. I would be the unofficial, official non-fantasy rule set on the Dungeons and Dragons VTT. They can have ultra modern because there's no setting attached to it. But the problem is everything else,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it is. And I was looking, Darcy, VIP of Wizards of the Coast. What's his surname? I can't remember. Darcy. It escapes my mind. But he was saying that the open game license is not something that can be. It's not something they can take away because you can have multiple open game licenses exist. He gave people the impression that the intention was it was possible to have multiple licenses and operate under those different open game licenses. So it's not that Wizards of the Coast can't make an open game license 1.1, but the intention by the people who put the first one in place, and maybe that's if it ever goes to court, is probably going to be the argument in the spirit of the people who initially put it together. I have a vacuum cleaner going in the background, people. My niece, if you are unaware, is only 3 years old, and it is raining, so she has to find things to keep herself occupied. But
We don't judge. I have degus over here. And
yeah. So I'll be quick so that Chris can start talking, and I'll mute my microphone. The thing that I see in this is that the Darcy's intention and the people who put it together initially, their spirit and intention was behind it to have multiple versions of the open game license, because they do state that they can be changed, but it doesn't say that it necessarily voids old open game licenses or versions of it in there. I am kind of curious, but I would hate to see somebody have to go through the hell of contending with litigation with Hasbro around that sort of thing. But that was my impression from what Darcy was saying, is the intention was not to have it irrevocable, that multiple licenses could exist, and that you could simply continue making 3.5 under the open game license for that one. And if they made an open game license for 5e, then they would just be able to... But he didn't actually mention that at all. He was actually referring specifically to the original version 3 open game license. That it was... The intention behind it was that they could make upgrades to the game and they could make new open game licenses. But the old open game licenses was never intended to be unauthorized in any way.
Well, okay. So for me, so Ryan Dancy, yeah, he came out and he said he helped write the OGL, and its intent was that it wasn't supposed to be revocable. And if fourth edition went OGL, potentially we would have a 3.5 OGL and a fourth OGL. Now we would have, once again, two OGLs that are running concurrently, one compatible with fourth edition, one compatible with 3.5. And that's kind of situation. So the thing is, there are already certain companies that have stated that they are pursuing legal action. There are several lawyers, because lawyers apparently play D&D. There are more than a half a dozen lawyers that have spoken up about this. And none of them have ever said, if WotC takes you to court, they will win. Don't bother to fight because they got you hook, line, and sinker. Almost everyone, of course, they're on our side, so whatever. But they have said, and we've seen lawyers on Roll for Combat and a few others, Games Lawyer. And I've reached out to a couple of other lawyers going, hey, that are on social media. I go, hey, can you want to voice in on this? It's great coverage for you because people will know who you are. But they have often, and they've said, and like the issue with the OGL is that there are certain specific terms. Like I was telling people, that when it says for your consideration, we kind of ignore that, but that actually has legal weight. There's actually a legal meaning to the words for your consideration. And everything in the dial, everything within the OGL indicates that it is a permanent, perpetual, irrevocable system where what Wizards of the Coast decided that they would create a reference document to allow other people to write for their system as a way of unifying and increasing D&D's umbrella. They gain from that. We gain from that. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. So for Wizards of the Coast to go after anybody, the fact that irrevocable isn't mentioned, but everything else mentioned alludes to it being irrevocable. That creates a slightly, and you said it so, a muddy field within that contract. The issue is, if Wizards of the Coast goes after somebody for a contract violation, and that goes to court, Wizards will try to do everything to not have that happen. They will file litigation, but the last thing they want is to have that case go to a courtroom. They want to threaten people with legal action, basically outspend them to prevent them from getting to a courtroom, because they don't have the legs I do believe they know that, because and this one lawyer said something very specifically, that whenever you have a contract with anything that's cloudy or up to interpretation, the law has almost always sided with the consignee and not the creator of the contract. If you created a contract that had money, then generally they will side on the people that signed the contract rather than people who wrote it. They very seldomly go on the side of the people who wrote the contract, which in this case would be Wizards of the Coast. So Wizards of the Coast, if they had a situation, they run the risk, because if they file something and someone says, "I'll see you in court, I got a lawyer," and this may happen once again with Parker Brothers, right? They take it to court, they lose, and now the precedent's set. Before they could send cease and desist letters and hopefully get away with it, if one of these things goes to court and Wizards loses, they lose all of their financial strength to do that. Because the moment they lose that one case, they can't send cease and desist anymore. That becomes, because at that point someone says, you just lost this court case. You can't send cease and desist because it's now been established in a court of law that the OGL is an irrevocable license. We won, you lost, and there's nothing you can do about it. So they have the ammunition right now until somebody decides to call them on that act and say, no, I'll see you in court. And what some people have estimated in the last few weeks, Wizards has tried to lock down the big players so that they don't do anything, because they have the money to go after them in court. So now, whether or not this is true, don't know. It's entirely possible that this actually did happen, that they are trying to lock down these big companies, which is the reason why they're not saying anything, because they all have these wonderful little, very sweetheart deals. That's the term I was thinking of, sweetheart deals, that locks off the expensive people from filing a lawsuit. And now suddenly these small people won't have it, but you only need one of those guys to go, we're doing a class action lawsuit, everyone get together, I'm funding it. And next thing you know, they're in a court case. That's going to cost a lot of people a lot of money, but it's a court case that Wizards is likely going to lose. And the question is, do they want to waste their time doing that? Going through all of this for the sake of potentially going to court in a case that they will likely lose. And that's kind of where we're at right now. This is a situation of threats and bluffs and seeing who's going to crack first. Because right now, we, like the third-party developers, have almost a uniform support from the community. There are a few trolls that are on the side of WotC, but they're pretty few and far between. I know some people who have said that they have been in comments, and there's tons of people that are against the third-party publishers. That's not been mine. Everywhere I go, there has been you go to Twitter on WotC, there's nobody defending Wizards of the Coast on Twitter. Wizards' Twitter page is being offloaded with a bunch of people saying, we're done supporting you. So the blowback has already began. And so the question is this worth it to them? And the problem is that big companies can't look at that sometimes. They're kind of blind to public opinion until it's too late. So that's the situation we're in right now. Is that are do we run away from the situation like they want us to run away and give up, or do we stamp our feet in the ground and go, no, we're actually going to fight back on this? And I think that what I said in my video, companies that say, "Oh no, we're as of today, we're cutting all of our 5e stuff. We're no longer doing anything for 5e, and we're leaving that industry altogether." I'm like, well, thanks for abandoning the people here that actually need this system to survive, and that's what I'm trying to push on people is to do that.
There's another thing that occurred to me. There's actually two things I wanted to say, and I'll say them fairly quickly because I know it's late where you are. But if it does go to court and somebody has to fight for the old OGL and say that like what they're trying to do and trying to deauthorize or make it null and void, well, what's the likelihood that Ryan Dancy is then called to court by somebody? Now, Wizards of the Coast... Guaranteed. Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, will not be wanting Ryan Dancy to step into court. But the person who's having to fight this says, Ryan Dancy, do you mind? Because I know you were part of that process. And
he's publicly... If someone approached Ryan Dancy and says, I can't comment on this, but the fact that he made him and Monty Cook have both publicly said this contract was not supposed to be revocable. And you go, I'm bringing the guy who ran the former vice president of Wizards of the Coast, who was there when this thing was written. Hello, sir. Here's the contract. Was it intended to be revoked? He says, no, it was intended to be perpetual and irrevocable. Thank you. No further questions. It's just like, how do they come back from that? I wrote the contract. I helped write the contract, and I'm telling you, it wasn't meant to be revoked. All they have is going to be a rules lawyer, ironically, who will look at it and go, the letter of the law is still in Watsy's favor. They can revoke it because the word irrevocable is not there. But once again, that's a lot to deal with. That's a big risk.
That's a great, huge, because that's like two people who can then step in who've stated that, and I suspect that those two people would be more than happy to step into a courtroom and vouch for the fact that somebody who's having to fight that say, look, no, that was not our intent. And the problem is that when things are muddy in any kind of license or agreement, and if you can get the people who were originally involved in the spirit of the formation of a contract, courts tend to go with that, don't they not?
Yeah, and Monty Cook is absolutely on this side, because not only has he said that this is irrevocable, but he has said the fact that he has his own OGL for Numenera, and he stated recently that now he is getting comments from people publishing under his system, because his OGL, its language was based off of the OGL 1.0 language. And because he also doesn't have the word irrevocable, suddenly a bunch of companies are going to him and going, are you going to do this? How can we trust any OGL now? Because any of them can be revoked because it doesn't have irrevocable dialogue. So Monty Cook is like, I now have to defend my OGL because of what's happening. So they are hurting me tangentially, because now these other OGLs are being questioned. Like, wait a second, can you do this? And the question is, people are like, and I think it's a valid question. I go, wait a second, how do we know that you're not going to? Your word for it? Wizards said they would never revoke it for 20 years, and now they are. How do we know that you sell your company to Hasbro and suddenly they revoke the Numenera license? How do we know? And so, yeah, this has ramifications outside of this massive spectrum of D&D, as other companies that are tangentially related to it are feeling that same pressure. So Monty Cook is absolutely, if he can say, no, that was it, and can prove in a court that it was irrevocable, that helps his reputation, because he wrote it and he has an OGL of his own that's related to it. He literally went to court case to defend the rights of an OGL that he helped write.
So the only way that those two people may not be able to be called to court is if they got a contract or an agreement that they signed when they left Wizards of the Coast that says that they can never actually go into court and voice anything against the company. Which I suppose is possible that there's something in an agreement when they left, but the chances are that there's probably nothing in there that can withstand the length of time. And when you leave a company and somebody presents a document that says, before you leave, you have to sign this, most people don't. They usually just give you the finger, and like if you can leave on an amicable way, great. And if you're gonna have to sign off a whole lot of stuff before you leave, that's usually like, nah, I'm going somewhere else.
A non-compete clause and so forth.
Yeah.
If Ryan was under that type of non-disclosure agreement where he couldn't speak up against the company, he wouldn't have said what he said last week.
Yeah.
He said something that could not be mistranslated. He was as direct as you can be when it comes to that topic. And if Wizards were concerned about this and about him, they would have intercepted that before he opened his mouth and said, hey, you're still bound by this, or we want to sign this contract to work with us. And by the way, you have to keep your mouth shut, because they know that if the people who wrote the original contract open up their mouths, and two of them have, that's going to be looked very unfavorably on them, because it's going to be much more difficult for them to prove their case in court when the people who wrote the contract are not on their side. So I think Ryan Dancy, if Ryan Dancy suddenly removes his comments and saying, I was taken out of context, I actually said we're 5.5, everyone's like, yeah, okay, so how much money did they give you? Because it's obvious at that point. I wouldn't even try. But right now, as it stands, he's basically on our side, which is going to bode very well for people in that situation. But like I said, that's the reason why when I say that I'm not interested right now in creating an offshoot, a clone, or an entirely original system, because until that document is official, and we know Wizards is concerned of the language, because it was supposed to be released 5 days ago with a deadline of the 13th, which is this week. And they're no longer giving people enough time to adapt or sign on to it, which means the contract that we're going to see, the OGL that's going to be released, will not look like the OGL has been leaked. They have no choice. They have to change it. They may just change the dates, but they wouldn't have delayed if there wasn't something that was concerning them. They're seeing, like, when the first controversy of the OGL happened at the end of December or mid-December, Wizards immediately, like when someone says they're going to take away this, so the OGL is under threat and third-party publishers are under threat, Wizards hit immediately and said, that's not true. We're still going to support the OGL. There's a new OGL coming in a few weeks. Right away, they intercepted it. This thing gets leaked 5 days ago, and Wizards hasn't said a thing, because there is a lot of dialogue going on right now. There are probably fights between legal teams and fights between people in the company about what's going to happen. You're having a group of people, probably led by the CEO, that's trying to push this thing as it's spoken. And there are people on our side within these companies trying to have them see reason. And that's the reason why we haven't seen it. If the OGL gets launched tomorrow, and it's exactly like the one that was leaked, except it gives us another 2 weeks, that'll show us that there was a fight, and those people in that company lost, and that was on us to pick up the pieces of that fight and move on. But I have this funny feeling that it would be incredibly tone deaf for them to just post the OGL and just walk away from it and just let the heat simmer, because it's just like, is that really the way you want to go? Because you know that D&D is a community-run organization, right? And like, yeah, I know that we're not your customer base, but we also all have microphones. And do you want to alienate the entire third-party community? Because unless you're paying a guy, every YouTuber is going to be against this. Every single person that's connected to this is not going to be on their side. They're going to lose all that equity.
Yeah.
And is that worth it?
Well, also too, it's not like back in 2000 or 2019 where there was maybe 20 people who were covering D&D on YouTube or RPGs. There's 400 plus channels because everybody was stuck at home with the pandemic. And so the voice is, even if they're not dealing with people who get 1 million views or 100,000 views or 10,000 views, The Voice is very big now, and there are small channels that are just creating tabloid style stuff just around this, and they're just exploding. I don't agree with it, but the aftershoot is the negative press is huge. I'm personally of the opinion that when they went from the OGL to the GSL, that they were tone deaf and weren't really paying attention to what needed to happen in the community in the first place. So I don't think that it's unlikely that they could not do that again, because they have done it in the past. TSR's done it. Obviously, Wizards of the Coast is not TSR, but they are also a company. I agree that they will probably not release whatever they have in terms of the OSL 1.1 in its current form, but I don't think that the form will actually be that great either. Because when I saw their announcement and they had those 3 things that they mentioned, and the first thing I saw is like that very first thing, it just is like suddenly, now you have to register and provide information.
Yeah.
And it's got to be licensed under us, but you won't have to pay money unless you make a certain income. Like that just eliminates, for me, Chris, I run a YouTube channel. I cannot provide them with all the data around everything that I do. If I had to do that, I cannot operate.
I'm lucky enough to be married to a bookkeeper, so I got those numbers down.
Yeah.
But most people, you're right, don't. Especially when you have multiple revenue streams coming from multiple directions. It's very difficult. We're not in the 750K. I am in the 50K plus group. So I'm between the 50K and the 750K group. And so I would have to report my income.
Yeah.
My worry, of course, is why do you care unless you're looking to amend this contract down the road to include us? If the worst case scenario, they do this and they say you're all automatically opted in, you have to do this or we go after you. And I say I made $105,000 last year, gross, not net. And they go, we're amending it now. We need 10% of that. And I'm like, well, I lost money off of that 100,000. There's no money to give you, right? Because when you're dealing with numbers like that, I mean, I know companies that had $1 million Kickstarters that lost money.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize, you made $1 million, you should be fine. Like I've been quite honest with people about my Amethyst Kickstarter. My Amethyst Kickstarter raised $106,000 after I took off all the fees that I owed to get backer kit to Kickstarter and all the advertising, and up to up to including the conversation you and I had back a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I calculate all that money I spent. That cost me $30,000. So out of the 100,000, I got just under 70. And that's
how long did you have to spend to actually make that? Like, I think a lot of people don't realize that the amount of time often when people wind up working in this area, you're not necessarily making the kind of money that you could make if you were working in a different sector.
Oh yeah, no, I've lost, thank God my wife gets paid good money now. I was pushing for her to get a promotion because she was worth more, and finally she got one. So she's actually making decent money for her kind of bracket. I walked away from a job that it wasn't moving up, but I am making half as much money now than when I did when that was happening. Now the year Affinity came out and the year Ultramarine came out, those were very, very good years because the profit margin was much higher with those. Naramata, the board game I put out, was a loss, and Amethyst will be a loss. So we're looking at almost a year of me not making about half as much as I do. So I'm relying now off of my drive-through RPG sales and physical product sales in order to kind of keep me afloat until my next Kickstarter, and then we'll see if that one's a success. But the point is that if they come down and say we want 20% of what you make because of that, I'm like, well, no, because that literally destroys me. And destroys most people. And some people don't understand. And that's why when this came out, Kickstarter got into negotiations and said, that's crazy. You can't take a quarter of these people's gross. And then Wizards like, okay, we'll do it for 20%. And then when people said to the guy who's running Kickstarter, and people were approaching him with direct questions, and he was answering directly. He says, we were fighting to get a lower rate because we know it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But when someone asks them, will you, if what if somebody puts up a non-OGL compliant book? Will Wizards force you to take it down? And his response was very direct also. We are not the enforcers of their company. We are our own entity. We are not their enforcers, which means if a non-OGL product goes up on Kickstarter, they will not shut it down.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold them to that.
So one of the biggest factors too, and this doesn't affect me because I don't even make enough money on what I do to actually register for tax or pay tax on my business in New Zealand. I have to make $16,000 a year in revenue before I even have to put in a tax return. And the reality is that the government knows that it takes $16,000 at least just to cover all your expenses to run a business in the country. So when I saw it was referring to gross rather than net profit, I was like, okay, so they've just taken all the profit that there was, so they got nothing now. So it's an easy way to eliminate competition by doing something like that, and whatever it winds up being, whatever it winds up turning into, the fact that they even considered doing something like this, and at this point, unfortunately, whether we call it leaked or not, I think there's enough evidence to support that this is a real thing.
Oh no, that was absolutely real. Like I said, if there was no controversy 3 weeks ago when the original OGL information started to get leaked, and if this thing didn't leak and they were looking at the tapestry and realized, oh yeah, nobody cares about third party, we would have seen this thing go online last week. But it's the fact that somebody leaked it, and there's been talk whether or not it was one of the game companies that received it as part of the NDA, or it was somebody inside of Wizards of the Coast. There's been a lot of speculation on who leaked it. I am willing to guess, like my assumption is chances are it's one of these game companies that really hates this thing and hate the fact that they have an NDA. So they quite privately snuck this out. My issue is that I doubt Wizards would let these guys read all 20-page contracts. I can't see that conference call saying, oh, by the way, here's the whole 20-page document for you. It seems like they were just, here are the clauses, we're going to go through it. So I'm suspecting that it was somebody internal within Wizards that leaked it.
I think it's both. I think somebody who got given the early access to the parts of the Open Game License 1.1 probably leaked it. And I think somebody within Wizards of the Coast probably leaked it. And because it's such a bad idea. And going back to, if you were to look at this, and I know your headspace is not in this, but I'm doing this deliberately, Chris, as you may or may not be aware. For those, because I know there's a lot of people out there who are like, okay, if I can't deal with the current situation and I'm going to make a new game system, like something like initiative, like the term initiative, even the concept of initiative, which is basically just a turn order. Yeah. Like all you do is if you're worried about Wizards of the Coast chasing you down because you used initiative, well, it's now just turn order. And like you couldn't copyright that to save yourself, as far as I understand. And then the concept of round or turn, like the concept of round and term itself, you couldn't copyright those because they're tied into so many board games and other games anyway. Like those very concepts. They're not copyrightable. You couldn't do that.
Yeah. Like I said, once again, because I have a lot of games that deal with combat, all of them do, and I have a lot of systems. Like some people, especially the younger people, they probably don't have much, but people like you and me, the old people, the vast majority of of the tapestry of my board games, I have 90% of my board games were published before 2000. That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I would think go so higher. I say 95% of the board games in my collection, even if you exclude the ones I've thrown out, 95% of my board game collection were published before 2000. And so if I were to go into those original systems, I guarantee you that I could find shared entries between Wizards of the Coast and that rule system. Yeah. So if you find initiative as a turn order of combat in another book, then that invalidates any potential for them to claim it. Same
particularly
thing with
particularly if doesn't have the open game license agreement in the back.
yeah. These are systems that I'm talking about rule sets that came out before the OGL was even thought of.
Yeah,
Palladium, GURPS, the leading edge systems,
yeah,
West End Games D6 system from the late '80s. You know, these are fantastically, completely original game systems that that will use the same tap terminology. Like look at GURPS. GURPS uses the 3D6 range structure of abilities. So
yeah. So, look, going back to, is there really any major structures and rules within 5e that couldn't be altered, adjusted to make them really not an issue? It's in terms of using them in a publication. For me, I can't think of too many because too much of it is, you know, even something as simple as the hide action or stealth, like hide, stealth, sneak. They're so general in their verbiage, and what they're trying to do. Like, what else would you call them? Do you know? If you're going to make a role play game, what else could you possibly call them other than hide, stealth, sneak?
yeah, and once again, you're going to the fact that like just off of GURPS, like GURPS is one of the first universal systems. That's quite literally what's called generic universal role playing system,
Yeah,
done by Steve Jackson. And the GURPS system, the basic attributes are strength, dexterity, intelligence, and health. So right then and there, you have a stat block that shares 80% of its structure, well, 50% at least, out of its structure out of D&D. So if D&D says we are copyrighting these set of attributes for structure, I go, wait a second. You are basically saying that GURPS published from '80s is technically copyright infringing on your block. You can't do that because you didn't exist as an entity back then. So how could you try to copyright it? And once again, the same thing with like they have perception, they have hit points, they have speed, they have movement. Palladium has their own set of systems. And that's just one example. I am taking one book out of the dozens I have in my collection, and just to think that they believe that they might be able to copyright all the definitions in fifth edition, I think that that's a pipe dream if they think they can do that. So I think personally that the idea of creating a 5e variant system where all the definitions were changed, I mean that's a safe way to do it. I think there's nothing they could. I'm 100% certain there's nothing they could do. But if you also came out with a 5e system that changed the wording, but the definition stayed the same, I don't think they can go after you for that either. That becomes a bit tricky, though, and they might go after you, and you might have a court case. But I don't believe that they technically have the legal standing. They could try, but I don't think that they'll win. And then you have the idea of somebody creating a brand new system, whole cloth, that shares their definitions but rewrites everything. Like I said, speaking of other systems, there's nothing they can do. So if I create a system that has strength, intelligence, dex, charisma, and all that stat block, armor class, and a D20 rolls and saving throws, but it's incompatible with anything that D&D has ever put out, I can't see them being able to try to fight that.
yeah. And you mentioned Level Up. So I went and looked at the website Level Up, and I was trying to find out what he built Level Up on, because basically he's the person there. I don't know much about them, but it looks to me like it's voiced as being an advanced Dungeons and Dragons 5e thing,
Yeah.
but I can't tell from what I see whether he's built that using the open game license.
He has.
He has. Okay.
He has, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I don't know the details on it. I do know that when him and I were talking, he was like, hey, sign on to onto our OGL. He made as a passing joke in a private email. And I was just like, but how are you safe? How are you safer than the original 3.5? Like, do you not have any language from the SRD in your document? If you're 5th edition compatible, how did you create a new OGL without copying their OGL unless your system works on top? Ultramodern 5 has an OGL, but that's only because we are adding to it. So I don't replicate anything in the SRD in my OGL. I'm just showing people all the new OGL stuff that I've added to this open gaming system. But at no point do I copy paste the SRD as part of that OGL. I could, but I didn't. So how does Level Up create an entire whole cloth rule system that's 5th edition compatible without copy pasting the SRD over to it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's been interesting because one of my issues that I've discovered, and because and I'm not suggesting that people should suddenly just decide, okay, that's it, we're going to go make a new game system. Certainly, waiting for Wizards of the Coast to make their move is a smart way to go. Whether that changes your approach to dealing with the company and their product is completely up to other people. For me, it's as I already explained, my mission statement was always to spread D&D. I can't actually make video content. I was looking at the fan policy is actually not as great as you might think. But given the reality of actually operating on YouTube or a website or any kind of thing like that, there's a lot of expenses. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've almost never used sponsorship, but I'm looking at using sponsorship this year. Under the situation, I could not have a sponsor. It would not work. And what was even more terrifying was the thing. Well, if they decide to chase after every RPG that's ever used their open game license, well, I can't really talk about those products either. And unless I sign on to the 1.1, if it survives its current leaked version, I really couldn't operate under them either. So like, what do I make? So it then begs the question: what sort of RPGs do you go and play if they're not connected to Wizards of the Coast IP or their open game license that they're developing? It's actually it was a tough question to sort of present to myself, because that's what I do, is I talk about and try to teach people how to play D&D, particularly 5e right now. But now I'm really having to look at it and say, well, maybe I'm teaching people how to play OSR, which is a strange.
A lot of my friends who are in the game publishing industry, all the people who are starting, are going through using the OSR as their framework. And some people have said, if Wizards goes the nth degree and tries to copyright every terminology, then they can go after the OSR as well. Which that would be, like I said, that's them going to war with the entire role playing community. Like, it's like the only fans you're going to have are 14-year-olds that weren't even alive with it when the 3.5 came out and don't understand or appreciate. Basically, you have the Stranger Things crowd. That's about it. I mean, it comes to a point that I was like half expecting celebrities to weigh in on this. Like I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, like I'm waiting for that moment where Henry Cavill posts an open D&D red banner on his page.
It's never going to happen.
Yeah,
Henry Cavill is too tied to community and anytime yes, but celebrities would just die. I don't think they would get so much negative press, so it just wouldn't.
No. I think if they came out in support of the open D&D movement, they would generate so much love and affection on their part.
Oh yeah.
Imagine if Elon Musk, who is ballsy enough, like, I don't like Elon Musk, I hate his guts, but he is probably the highest profile individual that would have the balls to post an open D&D thing. And he would be the type to do it just to stir the shit.
Yes, he would. Yes,
he has done worse.
yes. But we're not here to really necessarily talk about Elon Musk or celebrities coming out and voicing their disapproval of what's going on. So I'm of the opinion, Chris, that this conversation is going to probably come back, and in no way is this video is going to go up on my channel, and Chris is probably going to put up on his as well. Yeah. We're not going to plaster it with some sort of clickbaity, tabloidy. I know I'm not clickbaity. That's not where I'm at. If anything, the whole purpose of this is to show people just how ridiculous this attempt is, and how easy it would be if they really, really felt like they could not continue with Wizards of the Coast. how easy it would be for them to make another system that was so similar to what was already there, without having to worry too much. But also everything that I'm doing, even the name change and the thumbnail changes on my videos and so forth. And I will be, of course, moving forward, I will be making everything system agnostic, just for the sake of really proving a point to a company that I had supported for 6 years on
Yeah.
YouTube. And I'm a small channel, but I'm sure that there will be a lot of other people who will be doing the same sort of thing. So,
Yeah, and like I said, and like I reiterate, it's unfortunate that Wizards and Hasbro are taking what they don't really own away from us. And because I'll say it the fact that they may own the trademark to Dungeons and Dragons, but Dungeons and Dragons is run and owned by its community. And one of the things, the big difference between D&D and say FIFA 2023 by Electronic Arts is the fact that D&D requires the fans to make it work.
yeah.
You can play FIFA by yourself, you can play it online with nobody else, and you're still having this game that you can play. You can pop in Uncharted and play it by yourself, but D&D does not exist unless somebody sits down and says, I'm running a game. It doesn't matter where they do it, BTT or some other profile, do it in person. You need people for D&D to even exist. And that's the one thing that they need to understand that's different. No matter how much they try to monetize D&D in the same way that EA monetizes FIFA, they don't understand the fact that you need the community to do that. You can't rely on 8-year-olds with their parents' credit card. You need the support of the dungeon masters. And if you don't have the dungeon masters, you don't have a game.
So that's another thing I would like to point out, and you made it abundantly clear, is a role-play game does not exist unless you have the game masters on your side, because they make the game. And if you have a game that is tied to a game master or a dungeon master, I don't even want to use the DM word anymore, frankly, just in case.
I haven't. It's for me. It's actually it's like saying a curse. It's like DM. Yeah. It doesn't flow out of my mouth.
No, well. I'm going for game master from now on. But the thing is, this is one of the things that killed 4E. One of the things I used to run and operate 4E, open public games in stores, and talking with the community. The problem was that nobody wanted to dungeon master, or should I say game master 4E after a while, because it was all right at the very beginning, but it was too restrictive, and I know there's a lot of different reasons why 4E died, but ultimately in the end, I think what the problem was is there was nobody willing to run the game.
Yeah.
There just wasn't enough people, and even if you could get people together who wanted to play the game, nobody within that group that wanted to play the game could find somebody who was willing to pony up and had the balls to actually be the game master. And when I finally gave up on 4E, all my players loved it. We were a level 14. They loved the game. They wanted to keep playing, and I was miserable. And that's the thing that I discovered with a lot of other people. I'm not going near it. It's too much. It's too painful. It's not.
I was one of those few people that actually enjoyed running and playing with 4E. The one difference, which I said in my video, is the jarring shift when you have to shift from the mindscape to the table space, and you have to lay down the grid, because 4E was entirely grid based. You could not do it in the mind properly, and that was the jarring disposition, which is unfortunate. So I was like, okay. Today we're doing a battle. I'm rolling out the mat ahead of time, so that we start and we end. We're in a good position. Where 5E, I'm like, you can have a 5-second encounter. Like it takes 1 minute because it's over so quickly, and you can do that with 5E. But I didn't have a problem writing for it, and I didn't have a problem because I thought it was written by GMs in mind, and that's why I appreciated it, because I was never a player. But like I said, going back to what we said earlier, though, you're 100% right. The game is defined by the GM. And if people say we're no longer going to be running, if the streamers say we're dropping Dungeons and Dragons, then your entire spectrum fades. If you go to a gaming convention, and you mentioned like 4th edition, first year, you go to a gaming convention, 40 tables are running fourth edition D&D. I know we had conventions locally, and I go in there like 4 tables are running D&D, 1 table's running Pathfinder, and so forth. And then you come to it 2 or 3 years later, and nobody is running a 4E D&D campaign, which means that game is now dead. What killed it? Was it third party? No, it was apathy. And how we got to that apathy is incidental. Could have been third party, could have been rules, could have been anything, could have been economic downturn. The point is, at the end of the day, nobody ran the games and the game died. And that's the situation you have now. There's no such thing as an automated GM. That's called a video game, and we play it. Right? Now, and the irony of... You're going to get into that.
I'm going to get into that. I'm going to let you finish what you're saying, but I'm going to pick up because I actually think I have a suspicion as to why they decided to create that OGL 1.1, and I have a speculation, completely conspiracy theory, but I think it might have some weight. But I'll let you finish what you're saying.
But yeah. So that's the one thing that they're doing that's different. And right now they have these virtual tabletops, but every virtual tabletop needs a GM to run the system on their side. The irony about this is that 2 weeks ago, Wizards of the Coast canceled 6 video games that used a D&D license in development. So, off to you.
Well, one of the problems, and you know this, every time we have a revision of the rules, and this is what 1D&D is, the community fractures, right? And you wind up with people stay with the old system. Some people go to the new system. You pick up some new people in the new system. People might get frustrated and they decide that they're not going to even play the game anymore and they go and play something else. It's quite normal when people play games, right? If you play long enough, you wind up trying different systems. It's just one of the things you wind up doing usually, is you don't just stick with one system, you try different things. So I thought, well, maybe the OGL was a move to do that, to stop the fracture, to keep people in 1D&D or 6th Ed edition when it finally gets published. And the easiest way to do that is to kill everything that could potentially support the old system and third-party content for the old system, and avoid another Pathfinder developing out of 5e. And then I thought, well, yes, you could do that, but maybe that's not what's going on. And I did actually talk about this, but I'm going to rattle it off real fast. There's a whole bunch of things that happened in Wizards of the Coast. And I think what's going on right now, and I'll give you my evidence and you tell me what you think, Chris. I think that they are developing an artificial intelligence dungeon master who can run the game on the virtual tabletop that they are developing, the three-dimensional virtual tabletop, that will be able to work on a mobile phone and on your desktop. I think they've decided that what is stopping them growing is the fact that they are dependent on dungeon masters, game masters, and if they can eliminate that and they can pick up all the players that want to play the game, and the player base is quite fickle right now. If they don't like a dungeon master or a game master, they just disappear. I think they've actually probably started to figure out that they can actually make an artificial game master to run the game on their three-dimensional tabletop, and that's what's driving this. Now, why am I thinking this? Because I think that would be the only reason you would go to such ridiculous extremes like this that they're currently doing.
When they can survive the rejection of the game masters. Well, we don't need the game masters anymore.
No, we don't need you.
Yeah.
Here's let me list my rationale. CEO Ray Winninger suddenly disappears and goes. For what reason? We never really knew. We now have 2 new CEOs in Hasbro and in Wizards of the Coast, both from Microsoft, both very tech-focused, very experts in developing digital assets. That's what they do, and they do that well, and they did that really well with Microsoft, which means that they probably have access and knowledge of a lot of high-end technology that we don't see for free over the internet. So that was one of the things. Then suddenly, like, all of the D&D Beyond staff disappear, and then we've got 350 software engineers and staff operating, developing a three-dimensional tabletop and a mobile app. But, do you need that many to actually develop a three-dimensional tabletop? Did Tailspire need that many, and they built a three-dimensional tabletop? Do they need that to develop a mobile app? And then suddenly all of their video games. Why would you suddenly, if you're going to go after the digital market, and they've stated that that's what they're doing, going after the digital market, why would you dump 5 or 6 video games in development if suddenly that was your focus? Unless you had a product in development that you thought would make all those video games obsolete. And this is why I keep thinking that maybe that's what's going on here, that they've actually figured out and are relatively close to developing a full-blown artificial intelligence game master. And I'm going to test this when I go and get off my holiday. I'm going to go and play with Cleverbot and see if Cleverbot will let me run it through it in adventure. Without going wacky on me. Who knows?
Well, there is a company that is already using AI to create the adventure. So, in the answer to your question is, I will put cash on the barrelhead that you are 100% correct on that. The irony of the fact that they also said that 80% of their revenue is coming out of GMs. We need to monetize the players. And the solution to that is to cut out the 80% of revenue they're getting from Dungeon Masters by saying, no, the Dungeon Masters are out. We're just monetizing the players, and we have now AI GMs. And at that point, other GMs are like, well, you don't need our money anymore because we were the ones buying the books. So it's a very interesting course. You're 100% right. But it's an interesting course that they're thinking like 80% of our market is being eaten up by these GMs, which account for only 30% of the market. Can we afford to lose that and gain the monetization of the remaining 70%?
But it's not just that. I don't think that they're looking at just in terms of, we're going to lose 20 or 30% of our market because we're going to make game masters obsolete. I think they're thinking about the potential market where people struggle to play the game, and then suddenly you are in a system which is played on a virtual tabletop, and all you need to do is explain what you want to do, and the computer does everything for you. Rolls dice, decides what you're going to do, which is potentially possible.
We get the first 2 years where everyone hates it so much. Plus the fact that considering how much AI has been vilified in every avenue, especially now with art, for them to come out and say, oh yeah, we have AI GMs now, you're going to see like, say no to AI GMs. There'll be an equal thing because the moment like we've replaced, like this is our hobby. Yeah. We do this because of love, and you've cut us out of the system. Like I said, I bet you they're doing it, and I bet you that they're going to get hit again.
Yeah.
Once that gets announced.
But they know that the community is going to fracture, right? So if the community is going to fracture when you release a new game, then it's worth taking the risk. I think that's what they've decided. I think they've decided that when we go from the New Year edition, we're going to lose some people. So if we're going to lose some people, let's go for the full blind thing. I think double down on the market that isn't spending all the money. And if we lose the game masters because they are suddenly not part of this, I don't think you'll lose all the game masters. I think what they'll do is they're trying to fill in the gap because they deem this as long as we don't have enough Dungeon Masters, Game Masters to fill the role, to run games for people who want to play, let's fill the role ourselves. People will still run their games in their lounge and with people rather than computers. But we can then capture all that market that doesn't exist because people can't find a game without playing $20 for 4 hours or 3 hours or $100 an hour if you're in New York, apparently. I think that's potentially what's going on. I think they've got a big move, and it's not just a 3-dimensional virtual tabletop.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. But it's one of those situations where they are running the risk of potentially they are rolling the dice, to coin a phrase. I always remember Games Workshop, and Games Workshop. You want to talk about who's litigious? They sued everybody. And they were staunchly against any digital recreations of their merchandise. And for years, there was no such thing as a Warhammer video game. But then somebody had the bright ideas like, if you get them to play the game, they may end up, because they're thinking, if they play the game, they won't want to buy the miniatures. And then somebody said, that's actually the other way around. If you get the average person to play your game, they may hunt down and find the minis. And so way back with Relic and the first 40K Dawn of War, they decided to put an actual effort in creating a full-on representation of their board. And it became a huge success. And now there are a dozen different Warhammer 40K themed games about. And Games Workshop is positioned on their market, despite the rise of 3D printing, is massive. But they figured out, it's like, oh, yeah, we should probably do this. So But to say that some companies don't get the hint until it's really, really late in the game,
Yeah.
like they didn't start doing games for their Games Workshop properties until the mid aughts. I mean, throughout the 80s and 90s, there was nothing.
Mm.
And so, yeah, unfortunately, a lot of these companies, and there's no greater example right now than watching the slow destruction of Twitter. You know perfectly well that companies will go in a direction that will result in their self-destruction, and they'll know they're heading. It's like you're driving down a road towards the cliff. You can see the cliff, but no one can agree which direction to turn. And you get this situation. So unfortunately, you're right. Like we're probably going to see this, and by the middle or the end of this year, when all the cards are on the table, we'll look back and go, what the hell were they thinking?
Yeah.
And yeah, they're banking on the fact that 70% of their, I can't remember, the 70 or 80, 60 or 70% of their base are under 30 years of age, which means they're new gamers.
Yeah. They're
That
used to
they
playing
can,
video games.
yeah,
They're used to
yeah,
the digital framework. So,
yeah. They
and
don't care about the plus 40 GMs because they don't get any money. So their priority is trying to monetize the people that they think do not have loyalty to the people above the 40 market, the people who play the games from the traditional books and so forth.
yeah,
Um, but the only problem with that is that the one thing that the people under 30 also have is they love the responding to a controversy. They love voicing
Drama.
their hate. They love jumping on the new cult. And the moment you try to make D&D the villain, which is going to be easy, you create a situation where even people who don't play D&D are going to throw in their teeth. It was on IGN.
Hmm.
IGN talked about the OGL. And you think IGN would be neutral? No. The article that IGN posted on their YouTube page was them going, yeah, this is going to kill a third-party market. Wizards of the Coast, fix your crap. They were not on Wizards' side. IGN went right, double down on supporting the creators. And that was like surprising that IGN, which is a big company, would make that stance. Because and we're going to see that. We're going to see that more and more. And the court of public opinion, I don't think Wizards realize that even though there's a huge market of people that don't give them money, like I said before, they all have microphones.
Yeah.
And thanks to the internet, it's very easy for people to share this.
Yeah, and I think also too. I think I think in many respects they probably had to go down this route. This AI GM that I am speculating is going on before people start saying, that's impossible. The problem is that there are amateur websites that already have, fundamental sort of AI dungeon adventure creation or run you through an adventure, which, it's amateur. It's been built by somebody who didn't really have a lot of money or time, not necessarily all the skills that were required to actually make it do well. So people are already trying to do that. So if Wizards of the Coast does not make something like this, somebody else is going to make it before they do, right? I mean, that's the reality. That's where the technology is going. And I was like, okay, is it possible to make something like that? Nowadays, you can go from text to speech, and you can get a synthetic voice that sounds pretty convincing. Like it.
Oh,
Sounds,
I've no doubt that they will have a human sounding GM.
Yep.
The trick is that as someone who, as part of a research project, paid for Replica, which is the AI companion, boy, is there a lot of work to be done to be able to have a
350 software engineers might do it though.
Yeah, exactly right.
And I mean, even the military, that they've got robots that look like friggin' the Terminator, frankly.
Yeah.
You got drones that are artificially intelligent. They can be the size of your hand and will swarm troops.
Irony, the fact that I'm also in the middle of the AI art debacle, and the fact that it's like, all right, like no one's stealing your job, no one's stealing the artist jobs. It's like, oh, the GMs are now being replaced by AI. So I'm like, are you shitting me? It's one of those things where the AI artists are like, haha, now everyone's getting dragged into our fight. The GMs are the next to go.
Yeah.
And the writers are going too. Like I said, there are AIs that are producing one-shot dungeon adventures, and people are selling it for like $1 or so. And there's that market, but there's going to be a situation where the moment you eliminate Is like I'm not even paid to be a GM, and they took that from me. They're taking away. But that's the thing. There was a video I just saw a few days ago that talked about the monetization of enjoyment. You can't enjoy anything without paying for it now,
Hmm.
and that's an unfortunate truth that we've reached.
Yeah. All right, Chris. Is there anything else you would like to say before we sign out of this? Well, I mean, let's get real. This is like a rabbit hole, a pathway
Yeah.
down down into the forest, into who knows where. Really, my intention was to make it quite clear to people. There's a lot of stuff going on that we don't know. A lot of speculation. A lot of crazy stuff. But and also to talk to those people who are worried about D&D and those people who are now currently in the process of trying to make their own RPGs so that they feel like they can keep existing. Is
Well, one
anything?
thing I will add is that I think sometime this week I'm going to do a live stream, and I'm just going to design my 5.75. I literally I'll just do it communally, and I'll just sit there and going, okay, let's see what rules I like. Let's see what making work, and I will design a what if variant variant system that uses the architecture of Dungeons and Dragons without actually creating a 100% compatible system. I might do that. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe Wednesday. I will do that. I will go online and I will literally design it real time and seeing what I like and see what people think.
So, Chris, I was actually going to be doing that in a respect, but I was going to leave it till like much longer. But now that you've mentioned it, now I was thinking, oh, I was going to do it like in a couple of years. Maybe I should just go and tell everybody who's part of the Game Master Roundtable. Can you guys all go through the process of just building a new RPG as a live stream on your channels and just show people what's going on? Because that would actually, I think, probably be quite interesting what would come out the other end. It might shed a lot of light for a lot of people.
Yeah, I may actually do. I may. It depends on the situation. I may probably do it Wednesday. I'll start it early, and I'll just literally make it communal and go. Okay, let's design things. And I'll have a document open, and let's think about. And like I said, they'll see how far it goes, see how balanced it can make, and go. Okay, does this work? Does this work? And go on from there. I guess it's something I may try. But yeah, you're right. We've talked long enough. We've beaten this
Yeah,
horse.
yeah, we have.
But so thank you very much for giving me once again as we talk about another microphone.
Yep, that's right. So thank you, Chris, and I'm sure we will chat at some point in the future.
Oh yeah, this is not over.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you later.